Hello everyone, my name is Travis Campbell and I am the founder and president of Consider This, an organization dedicated to the defense of classical Christianity. This is part 4 of our Let's Get Scriptural series. We were looking at the life of Christ. In particular, we are exploring the very important issue of whether Jesus even existed. This is part 2 of our refutation of Christ-Mythicism. You'll remember in our previous video that we stated that the refutation of Christ-Mythicism can be given in 2 stages. First, there are multiple, reliable, non-Christian witnesses to the historicity of Jesus. There are the Greco-Roman witnesses, such as Thales and Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Tacitus, Marbar Serapion, and Lucian of Samosata. In the previous video, we looked at the statement of Thales concerning the darkness which occurred during the crucifixion of Christ. We also looked at the letter that Pliny the Younger wrote to Emperor Trajan, as well as Trajan's response to him. In those letters, we discovered what Christians believe at the end of the 1st century. For example, Christians worship Jesus as a God. At the end of the 1st century, Christians were meeting weekly and having a celebratory meal in Christ's honor. Christians were willing to die for their faith, and Christians refused to place a curse on the person of Christ. There are also Jewish witnesses, like Josephus and the rabbinic tradition. Here in this video, we will be looking at the writings of Suetonius and Tacitus. Who is Suetonius? Suetonius' full name is Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. He died sometime after the year 122. He was a Roman biographer and antiquarian whose writings include De Viris Illustribus, concerning illustrious men, which is a collection of short biographies of celebrated Roman literary figures, and De Vita Caesarum, the lives of the Caesars. The latter book was seasoned with bits of gossip and scandal relating to the lives of Julius Caesar and the first 11 Roman emperors, and secured Suetonius' lasting fame. Suetonius' family was of the knightly class, or equites, a friend and protege of the government official and letter writer Pliny the Younger, whom we explored in the previous video. He seems to have studied and then abandoned the law as a career. After Pliny's death, Suetonius found another patron, Septicius Clarus, to whom he later dedicated De Vita Caesarum. Upon the accession of Emperor Hadrian, he entered the imperial service holding probably simultaneously the posts of controller of the Roman libraries, keeper of the archives, and advisor to the emperor on cultural matters. Probably around the year 121, he was promoted to the secretary of the imperial correspondence, but in the year 122, or somewhat later, he was dismissed for the neglect of court formality, after which he presumably devoted himself to literary pursuits. Here is what Suetonius says what happened during the reign of Claudius. He, that is Claudius, banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. In the note on this statement, found in an edition of Suetonius' Lives, the editor, Thomas Forster, writes the following. Suetonius has already, in Tiberius 100, paragraph 36, mentioned the expulsion of the Jews from Rome, and this passage confirms the conjecture offered in the note that the Christians were obscurely alluded to in the former notice. The antagonism between Christianity and Judaism appears to have given rise to the tumults which first led the authorities to interfere. Thus much we seem to learn from both passages. But the most enlightened men of that age were singularly ill-informed on the stupendous events which had recently occurred in Judea, And we find Suetonius, although he lived at the commencement of the 1st century of the Christian era, when the memory of these occurrences was still fresh, and it might be supposed by that time widely diffused, transplanting Christ from Jerusalem to Rome and placing him in the time of Claudius, although the crucifixion took place during the reign of Tiberius. Luke, who gives us this reference in Acts 18, verse 2, mentions the expulsion of the Jews from Rome by the Emperor Claudius. Dio, however, says that he did not expel them, but only forbade their religious assemblies. It was very natural for Suetonius to write Christus instead of Christus, as the former was a name in use among the Greeks and the Romans. Among others, Cicero mentions a person of that name in his Epistulae Familiae, 11, paragraph 8. In the book entitled Partings, How Judaism and Christianity Became Two, a book edited by Herschel Shanks, Margaret H. Williams makes the following comment about this famous reference in Suetonius. Among the various interpretations of this much discussed passage, the one that sees in Christus a reference to Jesus Christ seems to me to be the most persuasive, since Christus is clearly attested as an alternative spelling of Christus, and Suetonius rarely bothers to supply the names of the minor characters who occasionally feature in his works. To be sure, this requires the assumption that Suetonius is being somewhat careless here. Obviously, the cause of the riots occurring around the year 49 cannot have been Christ himself, as Suetonius' Latin implies. Most probably, the riots were caused by debates within the Jewish community about the Christ or the Messiah that simply got out of hand. However, Suetonius is not always the most careful of writers, as even his admirers were ready to concede. As for the tumults themselves, these are best interpreted as analogues to those attested in several diaspora communities in the eastern provinces during roughly the same period. In various places in Asia Minor and Macedonia in the late 40s, attempts by Jews, most notably Paul, to disseminate the Christian message among their fellow Jews had resulted in ugly outbreaks of violence. Now there's another important reference in Suetonius' writings that is often overlooked when discussing these matters. While discussing the reign of Nero, Suetonius writes this: "He, that is Nero, likewise inflicted punishments on the Christians, a sort of people who held to a new and impious superstition." On this text, Forster says the following: "Superstitiones novae et maleficae are the words of Suetonius, the latter conveying the idea of witchcraft or enchantment." Suetonius also discusses in some detail the great fire that broke out in Rome in the year 64. Suetonius clearly lays the blame of the fire on the shoulders of Nero. And this is what he writes: "He, that is Nero, spared moreover neither the people of Rome nor the capital of the country." Somebody in conversation saying, "Emu thanantos Gaia mixtheto puri," "When I am dead, let fire devour the world." "Nay," said he, that is, nay, said Nero, "let it be while I am living, emu zantos." And he acted accordingly, for, pretending to be disgusted with the old buildings and the streets, he set the city on fire so openly that many of consular rank caught his own household servants on their property with tow and torches in their hands, but durst not meddle with them. There being near his golden house some granaries, the sight of which he exceedingly coveted, they were battered as if with machines of war, and set on fire, the walls being built of stone. During 6 days and 7 nights this terrible devastation continued, the people being obliged to fly to the tombs and the monuments for lodging and shelter. Meanwhile, a vast number of stately buildings, the houses of generals celebrated in former times, and even then still decorated with spoils of war, were laid in ashes, as well as the temples of the gods which had been vowed and dedicated by the kings of Rome, and afterwards in the Punic and Gallic wars. In short, everything that was remarkable and worthy to be seen which time had spared. This fire he beheld from a tower in the house of Mycenas, and being greatly delighted, as he said, with the beautiful effects of the conflagration, he sung a poem on the ruin of Troy and the tragic dress he used on the stage. To turn this calamity to his own advantage by plunder and rapine, he promised to remove the bodies of those who had perished in the fire and clear the rubbish at his own expense, suffering no one to meddle with the remains of their property. But he not only received but exacted contributions on account of the loss until he had exhausted the means both of the provinces and of private persons. Suetonius' portrayal of Nero is captured quite well in AD. What is AD? Well, you may remember the movie Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth is, in my estimation, the greatest portrayal of the life of Christ ever put on film. It is a masterful work of art, directed by Frank Zeffirelli, and has an all-star cast including Olivia Hussey, Rod Steiger, Anthony Quinn, and even the great Laurence Olivier. Robert Powell portrays Jesus in the film. The film is actually a 6-hour miniseries that originally aired in 1977 on NBC, and NBC will go on to air this miniseries every year or every other year up into the 1990s. What a lot of people don't know is that Jesus of Nazareth has a sequel, or quasi-sequel as is often called. It is a 9-hour miniseries called AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. AD picks up where Jesus of Nazareth leaves off. So, in Jesus of Nazareth, we begin with the birth of Christ and go to the resurrection. And AD will start with the resurrection and go into the 60s while the Christians are starting to be persecuted by Nero. Now, as a work of art, AD falls far short of Jesus of Nazareth. The score is not as good. There are a lot of cheesy scenes in there. And what is most frustrating, perhaps, is that the characters in Jesus of Nazareth are portrayed by different actors in AD, so there are continuity issues that can be frustrating. There's also a 6-hour version of AD, and I just have to recommend that if you're going to go all in, the 9-hour version is much better, if for no other reason. The 6-hour version takes out entire characters and scenes, and so at times in the 6-hour version, you're kind of lost as to what's going on. The 9-hour version is clearly far better developed. Now, as I say, AD falls far short of Jesus of Nazareth as a work of art. However, as history, AD stands up quite well. The scriptwriters clearly went out of their way to give the best portrayal of the various characters we know from history as they could. Most important, I think, are the contributions AD gives to our understanding of the emperors. They culled together quite well the historical sources and portrayed emperors ranging from Tiberius to Claudius and even Nero. Now, what I'm going to show you is a scene from AD where Nero is asking the Senate to help him rebuild his beloved city.
What I seek only for Rome. The city as it is offends my artistic soul. I would leave behind me an enduring monument of marble. The expenditure can be furnished from many sources. The people are ready for an increase in taxation after so long a period of fiscal clemency. There is gold lying unused in our city temples. And that fine device of the late Empress Messalina, that of offering Roman citizenship for sale, could be revived at even greater profit to the state. I say to Rome, to Rome. I must make this clear. Moreover, there are communities within the city who reject Rome, its virtues, its gods. I refer to the Jews and that sect known as the Christians. It would be a gesture of Roman clemency to allow these groups to continue their barbarous rituals, their insolent beliefs. But of course, to punish them with taxes. These are some of the ways in which to finance the building of our new city. But I acknowledge the wisdom of the Senate. Let me hear it.
Now, as you've already gathered from reading Suetonius' portrayal of these events, the Senate does not take too kindly to Nero's request, and so Nero puts matters in his own hands. We've already read Suetonius' portrayal of the event. What I'm about to read to you are the words of Cassius Dio from his Historiae Romani, which was written in the late 2nd century. Here is what Cassius Dio writes. After this, Nero set his heart on accomplishing what had doubtless always been his desire, namely, to make an end of the whole city and realm during his lifetime. At all events, he, like others before him, used to call Priam wonderfully fortunate that he had seen his country and his throne destroyed together. Accordingly, he secretly sent out men who pretended to be drunk or engaged in other kinds of mischief and caused them at first to set fire to one or two or even several buildings in different parts of the city, so that the people were at their wits' end, not being able to find any beginning of the trouble, nor to put an end to it, though they constantly were aware of many strange sights and sounds. For there was naught to be seen but many fires, as in a camp, and not to be heard from the talk of the people except such exclamations as, "This or that is a fire! Where? How did it happen? Who kindled it? Help!" Extraordinary excitement laid hold on all the citizens in all parts of the city, and they ran about, some in one direction and some in another, as if distracted. Here men, while assisting their neighbors, would learn that their own premises were afire. There others, before word reached them that their own houses had caught fire, would be told that they were destroyed. Those who were inside their houses would run out into the narrow streets thinking that they could save them from the outside, while people in the streets would rush into the dwellings in the hope of accomplishing something inside. There was shouting and wailing without end, of children, women, men, and of the aged altogether, so that no one could see anything or understand what was said by reason of the smoke and the shouting. And for this reason, some might be seen standing speechless as if they were dumb. Meanwhile, many who were carrying out their goods, and many too who were stealing the property of others, kept running into one another and falling over their burdens. It was not possible to go forward, nor yet to stand still, but people pushed and were pushed in turn, upset others, and were themselves upset. Many were suffocated, many were trampled underfoot. In a word, no evil that can possibly happen to people in such a crisis failed to befall them. They could not even escape anywhere easily, and if anybody did save himself from the immediate danger, he would fall into another and perish. Now this did not all take place on a single day, but it lasted for several days and nights alike. Many houses were destroyed for want of anyone to help save them, and many others were set on fire by the very men who came to lend assistance. For the soldiers, including the night watch, having an eye to plunder, instead of putting out fires, kindled new ones. While such scenes were occurring at various points, a wind caught up the flames and carried them indiscriminately against all the buildings that were left. Consequently, no one concerned himself any longer about goods or houses, but all the survivors standing where they thought they were safe, gazed upon what appeared to be a number of scattered islands on fire, or many cities all burning at the same time. There was no longer any grieving over personal losses, but they lamented the public calamity, recalling how once before most of the city had been thus laid waste by the Gauls. While the whole population was in this state of mind, and many, crazed by the disaster, were leaping into the very flames, Nero ascended to the roof of the palace, from which there was the best general view of the greater part of the conflagration, and assuming the lyre player's garb, he sang the capture of Troy, as he styled the song himself, though to the eyes of the spectators it was the capture of Rome. The calamity which the city then experienced has no parallel before or since, except in the Gallic invasion. The whole Palatine Hill, the theater of Taurus, and nearly 2/3 of the remainder of the city were burned, and countless persons perished. There was no curse that the populace did not invoke upon Nero, though they did not mention his name, but simply cursed in general terms those who had set the city on fire. And they were disturbed above all by recalling the oracle which once in the time of Tiberius had been on everybody's lips. The oracle ran thus: "Thrice 300 years having run their course of fulfillment, Rome, by the strife of her people, shall perish." And when Nero, by way of encouraging them, reported that these verses cannot be found anywhere, they dropped them and proceeded to repeat another oracle, which they averred to be a genuine Sibylline prophecy. The oracle ran thus: "Last of the sons of Aeneas, a mother slayer shall govern." And so it proved, whether this verse was actually spoken beforehand by some divine prophecy, or the populace was now for the first time inspired, in view of the present situation, to utter it. For Nero was indeed the last emperor of the Julian line. The line descended from Aeneas. He now began to collect vast sums of private citizens as well as from whole communities, sometimes using compulsion, taking the conflagration as his pretext, and sometimes attaining it by voluntary contributions as they were made to appear. As for the Romans themselves, he deprived them of the free dole of grain. And thus are the words of Cassius Dio concerning the destruction of Rome. So how should we evaluate Suetonius' witness to the existence of Jesus? You remember the original claim we quoted from Suetonius' writings. Claudius banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Christus. Robert E. Van Voorst, in his book Jesus Outside the New Testament, evaluates Suetonius' witness as follows. The positive results for the study of Claudius are meager, especially in view of the difficulty the celebrated sentence presents. The thrust of the sentence is clear, that Claudius took measures against at least some Jews in Rome after continual disturbances. The center of the difficulty is the identity of Christus. We have seen first that the better explanation of this difficulty is that Christus is a mistake for Christus. We have shown that this is probable, but to claim certainty is to go beyond the spare and somewhat equivocal evidence. Second, Suetonius' statement indicates how vague and incorrect knowledge of the origins of Christianity could be, both in the 1st and early 2nd century. Similar sounds and spelling led him, like others, to misread Christus as Christus. Continued public unrest over this Christ led Claudius to take the same action that other Roman officials had taken in this sort of situation: send the troublemakers packing. From this initial misunderstanding came the idea that this Christus was actually present in Rome as an instigator in the 40s. Although Suetonius did view Christ as an historical person capable of fomenting unrest, his glaring mistakes should caution us against placing too much weight on his evidence for Jesus or his significance for early Christianity. I agree with Van Voorst as far as he goes, but one of the things that Van Voorst does not discuss is Nero's persecution of the Christians in the 60s. And I think all of this is very important for getting an understanding of who the Christians were, their relationship to Christ, as well as Tacitus reference to Jesus, which we will now discuss. So who is Tacitus? Tacitus, whose full name is Publius Cornelius Tacitus or Gaius Cornelius Tacitus, and died around the year 120, was a Roman orator and public official, and was probably the greatest historian and one of the greatest prose-stylists who wrote in the Latin language. Among his works are the Germania, describing the Germanic tribes, the Historiae, concerning the Roman Empire from the years 69 to 96, and then later the Annals, dealing with the empire from AD 14, which marks the rise of Tiberius to power, to the year 68. In the year 77, Tacitus married the daughter of Gnaeus Julius Agricola. Agricola had risen in the imperial service to the consulship in 77 or 78, and he would later enhance his reputation as governor of Britain. Tacitus appears to have made his own mark socially and was making much progress toward public distinction. He would obviously benefit from Agricola's political connections. Moving through the regular stages, he gained the quaestorship, often a responsible provincial post, probably in the year 81. And then in the year 88, he attained the praetorship, a post with legal jurisdiction, and became a member of the priestly college that kept the Sibylline books of prophecy and supervised foreign cult practice. After this, it may be assumed that he held a senior provincial post, normally in the command of a legion, for 4 years. Here is Tacitus' witness concerning the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome, which took place in the year 64. Of Rome, meanwhile, so much as was left unoccupied by its mansion was not built up, as it had been after its burning by the Gauls, without any regularity or in any fashion, but with rows of streets according to measurement, with broad thoroughfares, with a restriction on the height of houses, with open spaces, and the further addition of colonnades as a protection to the frontage of the blocks of tenements. These colonnades Nero promised to erect at his own expense, and to hand over the open spaces when cleared of the debris to the ground landlords. He also offered rewards proportioned to each person's position and property, and prescribed a period within which they were to obtain them on the completion of so many houses or blocks of building he fixed on the marshes of Ostia for the reception of the rubbish, and arranged that the ships which had brought up corn by the Tiber should sail down the river with cargoes of this rubbish. The buildings themselves, to a certain height, were to be solidly constructed, without wooden beams, of stone from Gabi or Alba, that material being impervious to fire, and to provide that the water which individual license had illegally appropriated might flow in greater abundance in several places for the public use. Officers were appointed, and everyone was to have in the open court the means of stopping a fire. Every building, too, was to be enclosed by its own proper wall, not by one common to others. These changes, which were light for their utility, also added beauty to the new city. Some, however, thought that its old arrangement had been more conducive to health, inasmuch as the narrow streets with the elevation of the roofs were not equally penetrated by the sun's heat, while now the open space, unsheltered by any shade, was scorched by a fiercer glow. Tacitus continues his witness with these words: "Such indeed were the precautions of human wisdom. The next thing was to seek means of propitiating the gods, and recourse was had to the Sibylline books, by the direction of which prayers were offered to Vulcanus, Ceres, and Proserpina. Juno, too, was entreated by the matrons, first in the capital, then on the nearest part of the coast, whence water was procured to sprinkle the fane and image of the goddess. And there were sacred banquets and nightly vigils celebrated by married women. But all the human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against humankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer, or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed. What is the value of Tacitus' witness? Well, Richard Carrier, who is considered by many to be the greatest living defender of Christ-Mythicism, questions the authenticity of the line, "The author of the name, Christ or Christus, was executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius." He thinks that this line is probably a later Christian interpolation. In other words, he thinks a later Christian scribe inserted this line into Tacitus' work. He reasons as follows, writing, "The first clue that the line in question might not be authentic is that our manuscript containing this passage had originally spelled the persecuted group as the Christians, not the Christians, and that this was subsequently corrected by erasure. To explain this, it is more likely that Tacitus originally wrote Christianos, Christians, than that this was produced by subsequent error from Christians and then corrected back again. And if that's the case, it's not believable that Tacitus would have explained the name Christians using the name Christus. Instead, obviously, he would use Christus, which may also have been the original reading here, corrected earlier in the text transmission history. I want all of you to notice Carrier's reasoning here, which I submit is quite weak. He says, it is not believable that Tacitus would have explained the name Christians using the name Christus. Obvious, he says, it is obviously the case that he would have used the word Christus. Now, assuming for a moment that his reasoning here is valid, it doesn't really make that much of a difference because we already have Suetonius as witness, where Suetonius refers to Christ as Christus. So even if Tacitus did refer to Christ as Christus here, you couldn't really make a whole lot out of this. This would just be a case of a common Roman mispronunciation of the name. But I want to submit that the use of the words obvious and not believable are just not warranted here. That is an overreach of immense proportions. It is not just obvious that Tacitus would have used the word Christus instead of Christus. To further this point, I quote Robert E. Van Voorst, who makes the following point concerning the manuscript tradition behind Annals 1544. He says this, "The only textual difficulty of particular importance for our study comes at the first and only use of Christians in chapter 44. Most older critical editions read Christianoi, Christians. However, the original hand of the oldest surviving manuscript, the Second Medicean in the 11th century, which is almost certainly the source of all other surviving manuscripts, reads Christianoi, Christians. A marginal gloss corrects it to Christianoi. Christianoi is to be preferred as the earliest and most difficult reading, and is adopted by the three current critical editions and the recent scholarship using them. It also makes better sense in its context." Now note this, note what Van Voorst says here. He says, Tacitus is correcting, in a way typical of his style of economy, the misunderstanding of the crowd, vulgus, by stating that the founder of the name auctor nominis eius is Christus, not the common name implicitly given by the crowd, Christus. What Van Voorst is saying is that Tacitus, elitist that he is giving a subtle correction of the crowd, the vulgar people, the uneducated. Tacitus may have even used the word stupid, mispronounced the name of these people all the time. You can almost hear Tacitus sitting amongst his friends, reading this paragraph to them, and them giggling when he gives this subtle correction. Those crowds, those vulgar people, commonly called these people Christians. The founder of the name, Christus, experienced the extreme penalty during the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate. Now, it may be that Van Voorst is wrong here, but he's not obviously wrong. What he's saying is not unbelievable. And I would like to submit that he has simplicity on his side. The simpler explanation, the one that requires the least amount of speculation, is that Tacitus, in accordance with his style elsewhere, gives a subtle correction to the crowds who called these people Christians, namely, that their founder was Christus. Now, despite the fact that Richard Carrier's reasoning is obviously not obvious, and that it is believable that Tacitus used the word Christus and not Crustus, Carrier goes on to make inferences that are just way out of bounds. Notice what he says here. I think it's more likely that Tacitus has already explained who the Christians were in his account of the Crustus riots, those also recorded by Suetonius, which would have appeared in his section of the Annals for the early years of the reign of Claudius, now lost. Full stop. Notice what Carrier is doing here. He's saying that it's more likely than not that Tacitus refers to the Christians and explains who they are more in his section on Claudius. It's a section of Tacitus' work that we don't have. So the question is, how does Carrier know that it's more likely than not that Tacitus did this? He doesn't. He doesn't know for two reasons. The most important one is that this section in Tacitus' work is lost. He doesn't have it. He has no foundation to make this inference. Also, as we just showed, it is simply not obvious that Tacitus would not have used the word Christus. It is believable that he would have used the word Christus. And besides, Suetonius does use the word Christus, but we've already seen that it's more likely than not that he's referring to Christ. But it gets better than this, or worse, if you will. He says this: if that is the case, notice this sentence follows what he just said. So on the basis of a section of Tacitus that we no longer have, it's been lost, on the basis of what is lost, on the basis of sheer silence, on the basis of sheer speculation, he says, if that is the case, if what I've just speculatively said is the case, then what would become the Testimonium Tacitium was originally about the sect of Jewish rebels first suppressed under Claudius, who were at that time led by their namesake Crustus, and were thereafter named for him, whether he was still alive or not. So Carrier is attempting to erase Christ from the pages of history. And how is he doing so? He's doing so by saying that there was a guy in the 40s named Christus. And this guy led a group of people called the Christians. And this guy was a Jew. He led a sect of Jewish rebels. And these people had nothing to do with the Christians led by Christ. And he's inferring this again on the basis of sheer speculation. He doesn't have any evidence to say such a thing. Now, Carrier may respond, well, do you have any evidence? Well, yes, we do. We actually have evidence that the Christians were often called Christians. Tertullian, in the latter part of the 2nd century, in his Apology, writes the following: well now, if there is this dislike of the name, What blame can you attach to names? What accusation can you bring against mere designations, save that something in the word sounds either barbarous or unlucky, or scurrilous or unchaste? But Christian, so far as the meaning of the word is concerned, is derived from anointing. Yes, and even when it is wrongly pronounced by you, Christianus, for you do not even know accurately the name you hate, it comes from sweetness and benignity. You hate, therefore, in the guiltless, even a guiltless name. In order for Carrier's speculation to work, he has to postulate that a group of people who had no connection to Christians, called Christians, led by Christus, existed for a season and then presumably died out. In fact, we're going to see in a moment that Carrier thinks that the Christians were a sect that no longer existed by the time Tacitus wrote his annals. Carrier has to believe that these Christians, led by Christus, died out, and then later, apparently sometime in the 2nd century, before Tertullian comes on the scene, Christians were commonly referred to as Christians by the Romans. Now I'll submit the simpler hypothesis, the one that has with it the least amount of speculation, is that Christians was a common designation that Romans gave to Christians, and they often commonly referred to Christ as Christus, and that Tacitus is subtly correcting them here, and Suetonius, as we've already seen, an uncareful historian at many points, simply refers to Christ as Christus. All of this is far simpler than Carrier's very speculative and highly unwarranted conclusions. What are Carrier's 5 arguments for interpolation? Well, on the basis of what we've just seen, on the basis of a speculation that is grounded ultimately in an argument from silence, Carrier gives these 5 arguments that the text that we're discussing is a later Christian interpolation. The first argument is this: the text flows logically and well with the line removed. My answer is that, yeah, that's true, but the line is also very short. You can remove almost any line from any short paragraph, and the paragraph can read smoothly without the removed sentence. So this is not a very good first argument for interpolation. Carrier's second argument is that the notion that there was a huge multitude of Christians in Rome to persecute, though not impossible, is somewhat suspect. Whereas by contrast, Jews were present by the tens of thousands, and there were already enough Christus followers under Claudius to result in a citywide action against them. Notice here that Carrier replaces a possibility that there could be thousands of Christians in Rome with the probability that the Jewish so-called Christus followers are more likely referenced here. But Carrier has no documentary evidence that his purported Christus followers even existed. We've seen this. He can ring the changes of Suetonius and Tacitus all he likes, but an equally plausible interpretation of Tacitus and Suetonius exists, namely that they are both talking about the Christians and Christ. And our argument is grounded in all sorts of documentary evidence, from Suetonius to Tacitus and even Tertullian. So notice that Carrier is replacing the known with the not yet established and calling it likely. And so I submit again that this is just not a very sober line of reasoning. Carrier's third argument is that it is not clear why Tacitus, much less the general public, would regard the Christians as criminals who deserved the most extreme punishment merely for being enthralled to a vulgar superstition, which was actually not even a crime, much less a capital one. But if these were the Christians who were already hated for their previous urban violence, which Tacitus would have recounted in an earlier book when he treated the Christus riots, also mentioned by Suetonius, their deserving of extreme punishment will be a more intelligible sentiment. Well, notice again that here Carrier appeals to a lost portion, or lost portions, of Tacitus' work to prop up his theory that Crassus is not Christ and that the Crustians were an alternative sect to Christians. But he has no documentation for this hypothesis. In fact, Christians are the Crustians involved, if in fact Christians are the Crustians involved in the riot during the days of Claudius, then we know why they were despised. In any case, even without the Suetonius reference, Christians would have been hated for their superstitions, combined with their worship of a new god and the rejection of the old Roman gods. And that is an act of hatred against humankind from a Roman point of view. So Suetonius has already mentioned the fact that Nero persecuted the Christians who are known for their enchantments and their superstitions. So the fact that Suetonius refers to Nero's persecution of the Christians, along with Tacitus' statement that the Christians were persecuted by Nero, is strong evidence that the Christians were the Christians. So again, Tacitus has no documentation, and the standard view has sufficient documentation. Carrier's fourth argument is this. Tacitus says the people called them Christians, notably in the past tense. Why would he not use the present tense if he believed the group was still extant, as Christians were? Now, as I said before, I told you that Carrier believes that the Christians no longer existed. And this is the evidence that Carrier believes this. So again, he believes that the Christians were a sect of Jews that died out by the time that Tacitus wrote his annals. And so he has to speculate, given what we have in Tertullian, he has to speculate that sometime in the 2nd century, the name Christian was transferred from this group that died out to the Christians. My answer to Carrier as to why Tacitus referred to Christians in the past tense is this. He referred to them in the past tense possibly for the same reason that the author of Acts uses the past tense when introducing the name Christians to his readers. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. In other words, the past tense in and of itself in no way indicates that the author believes the sect is no longer around. Now, a more important point is given by Tim O'Neill, and I must take this time to thank Tim O'Neill to show my indebtedness to him. His blog article, Jesus Mythicism 1, the Tacitus reference to Jesus, was very helpful to me when I was preparing this material. And this is what Tim O'Neill says. He says regarding Carrier's argument that this is a strange argument. Indeed, it's a very strange argument. Tacitus is talking about events in the past, so it makes sense that he would use the past tense. I can say Germans in the 1930s nicknamed them the Nazis, despite the fact that there are still Nazis today. This also makes even more sense if the common people in Tacitus' time were more familiar with Christians than the Roman crowd 50 years earlier and knew they were called Christians rather than Christians. Tacitus is therefore possibly drawing attention to the erroneous appellation used by the crowd a generation earlier. Now, given the, and O'Neill knows this, but given the fact that Tertullian will later say what he says, it's clear that there was just a mixture of understanding of who these people were. Some people called them Christians, some people called them Christians. Tacitus and his the nobles that he will often be writing to, and the nobles that are running in his circles probably would have known better. Now, this fifth argument for interpolation is what Carrier considers to be his strongest argument, but in fact, it's actually his weakest argument, as I'll explain. Carrier says this. He says, there is no evidence that this event even happened. The burning of Rome itself is well attested by both literary and physical evidence, but no one seems to have ever known Christians were in any way connected with it until late in the 4th century. Now, think about this. Nero punishes the Christians for the fire, according to Carrier, and those Christians had nothing to do with Christians. And yet, no one speaks of the Christians being blamed for the fire either in the 2nd century, 3rd century, and 4th century. In other words, Tacitus is our only witness to the persecution of the Christians in connection to the fire, or Tacitus is our only witness to the persecution of the Christians, who were not Christians, in being blamed for the fire. Either way, you only have a single reference. It's either the Christians or the Christians, and we're simply saying that the Christians are the Christians. Carrier's argument, of course, begs the question, since we have the reference in Tacitus testifying that the Christians were blamed for the fire. Suetonius, as we have seen, mentions the persecution of the Christians under Nero, as well as the fire of Nero, though he does not connect the two. That is to say, Suetonius does not say the persecution of Christians was due to their being scapegoats for the fire. And then again, why would Nero persecute the Christians merely for engaging in superstition, as Carrier himself earlier asks? I mean, think of this. Carrier says there's no reason why the Christians would have been persecuted. However, if they were blamed for the fire, that might be a reason. And so the conventional reconstruction is just simpler. Both Suetonius and Tacitus attest to the fire and the Christian persecution. Suetonius clearly blames the fire on Nero, while Tacitus, who is somewhat ambiguous as to whether Nero ordered the fire, gives the reason why the Christians were persecuted. And so it's quite easy to harmonize these somewhat disparate accounts, but the harmonization comes very easy without strain when you simply make the correction of Suetonius, Christus is Christus, and you note that Tacitus is simply correcting a common misunderstanding of the crowds, namely, they often call the Christians the Christians. Now, Carrier does raise the legitimate point as to why, if Christians really were blamed for the Great Fire and persecuted, did no one explicitly mention this until the 4th century? His is a good question, but it hardly constitutes an argument. He bears a high burden to show that more probably than not, the silence in the centuries after Tacitus is best explained by the fact that the Christians were not persecuted by Nero. Instead, the Christians, a sect that no longer existed in Tacitus' day, were the ones who were persecuted, only to then have their name taken from them decades later and wrongly applied to Christians. That's a very tall order, and Carrier has come nowhere close to meeting it. Now, in addition to what I've just said, there is a very curious reference found in the apocryphal Gospel of Peter. Notice what Peter says, and this is obviously not written by Peter himself. The Gospel of Peter is a mid-2nd century document. It is called apocryphal. It's not something that the early Christians ever thought was all that reliable in terms of giving an accurate portrayal of Jesus. But having said that, there are interesting statements in there, and there are some things that people have thought might be historical. Now, whether what I'm about to read to you is historical or not, it does at least indicate what Christians were thinking in the mid-2nd century. And here's what the Gospel of Peter says. Then the Jews, the elders, and the priests, knowing how much wrong they had done to themselves, began to mourn and say, "Woe to our sins! The judgment and the end of Jerusalem is near." But I, with my companions, was grieved, and being wounded in mind, we were hiding, because we were being sought by them as wrongdoers and as wanting to burn the temple. On top of all this, we were fasting, sitting, mourning, and weeping night and day until the Sabbath. So in the wake of the crucifixion, the Jews are pounding their chests, and they believe that the destruction of Jerusalem is nigh, and the Christians are hiding, and the Christians have gained the reputation of burning the temple, among other things. Now, the Gospel of Peter is the only witness we have that the Christians had the reputation for burning the temple. It's a mid-2nd century document, and a lot has happened since then. The Great Fire of Rome, the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, 6 years after the Great Fire of Rome, and then later the Bar Kokhba Revolution, which happened in the 30s of the 2nd century. And so by the time the Gospel of Peter is written, a lot has happened, and it is quite possible that the Gospel of Peter is conflating all sorts of things. He may very well be conflating the Christian desire to destroy the temple with the Christian reputation for having burned Rome. Now, where would we get any kind of reputation among Christians that they want to destroy the temple? Well, in the Gospel of John, we have Jesus saying, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And at his trial, the Gospels tell us that the Sanhedrin accused him of saying those words. And so you can see why, maybe in the late 2nd century, or the late 1st century rather, Christians are blamed for these kinds of things. They want to destroy the temple. Or they're blamed for the fire in Rome, as Tacitus says. And so people are just conflating these kinds of accusations. The Christians are arsonists. So, if I'm reading the Gospel of Peter right, and Peter is conflating all these kinds of accusations, then we do have a 2nd century reference to the Christian connection to the fire in Rome, namely, that they were blamed for the fire. But let's say that I'm reading this wrongly, and that this has no connection to the fire in Rome. Nevertheless, it's clear that Christians were accused by the time we hit the middle of the 2nd century of arson. It's obvious that this is a subtle reference. This is not something that the Gospel of Peter explores in any detail. And none of the other Christian writers of the 2nd century are clearly going to want to mention this. No one wants to mention the fact that they are known as arsonists. The Christians have already been persecuted several times by Nero, during the Domitian reign, by Trajan. These are isolated persecutions, to be sure, and yet they are persecutions. The Christians are not held in high repute in the 2nd century. There's no reason they would want to introduce the potential of even more accusations to come upon them. And because Christians are of no real importance to Romans, it's not all that obvious that they would mention it either. And so Carrier, though he does ask a good question, his question does not rise anywhere close to the level of a good argument. And I've already given, right here from the Gospel of Peter and some of the things that I've said, a plausible explanation as to why the Christian connection to the fire was never given. But I also need to repeat, no reference to a group of Christians with no connection to the Christians as starting the fire is given either. So why Carrier would think that this is a really good reason for interpolation is beyond me. But let's compare Carrier's thesis with the standard view. Carrier argues as follows. Suetonius' reference to Christus does not refer to Christ, but to an altogether different individual, a Jew who instigated a riot in the days of Claudius. Tacitus clearly refers to Christians who are probably the followers of the Jew Christus, not Christ, and so they are not Christians. Hence, the reference to Christ in Tacitus must be a Christian interpolation. The Christians died out as a movement by the time Tacitus wrote his Annals around the year 110. Sometime later, for an unknown reason, Romans typically referred to Christians as Christians. Now, that last line is not really a part of Carrier's thesis. However, given what we read in Tertullian, this has to be a part of his thesis. He has to say this, unless he just wants to get rid of Tertullian, but that would just be an argument from convenience. Compare this Carrier thesis with a conventional view. Suetonius' reference to Christus refers to Christ, whom the historian says instigated a riot during the days of Claudius. Hence, either Suetonius or his source made an error. In other words, Suetonius made the error, or perhaps he went into the archives and found in the records the record of a Roman soldier who was a part of the riot, maybe even a group of Roman soldiers. And when they came in to report what was going on in the days of Claudius in Rome, the report said, well, they're all getting upset over something a guy named Christus has done. And so the auditor just wrote down Christus started this riot, when in fact it was really just a group of Jews and Christians arguing with one another and even fighting one another over the identity of Christ who had lived during the reign of Tiberius. Now, this explanation that the error is either Suetonius or his source is not as ad hoc as it might initially seem, since even Suetonius' admirers have accused him of being sloppy at times. Also, it is easy to see how a Roman giving a report could pronounce the name Christus and even give the impression that the individual started the riot. Tacitus later notes how the Roman crowd called Christians and then subtly corrects them by noting that their founder, Christus, founded their movement before dying the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate. So those are the two theses. I submit that the conventional one is simpler. What is the evidence for these respective theses? Carrier's evidence is this. First, he has an argument from silence. Surely other writers would have mentioned the Christian connection to the Great Fire. He also has an argument from silence. Tacitus must have written about the now deceased Jewish movement of the Christians in a now lost portion of the Annals. That's his evidence. On the other hand, the conventional thesis has several lines of strong evidence. There are good reasons to think that the text we have is substantially what Tacitus wrote. First of all, a Christian interpolator would not have written so harshly of Christ and his movement. How do we know this? Well, in the last video, we looked at Pliny the Younger, who tells us that Christians will not curse Christ. Christians were known for not ever wanting to say anything blasphemous or negative about Christ. And so Tacitus, no Christian interpolator would want to later come along and say such horrible things about the Christian movement. Remember, Tacitus does not like Christianity. He thinks this is stupid and wicked superstition. He thinks that it is a horrible movement, and he thinks that it's all foolishness. And so it's highly unlikely, we'll just say that, it's highly unlikely that a Christian would have put those lines in. Tacitus, also, our second line of reasoning is that Tacitus, a Roman noble, does not explicitly state how Christus died, but merely says that he suffered the extreme penalty. This is curious if this was written by a Christian. Christians had become comfortable by the end of the 2nd century to speak of Christ being crucified. If we read the letters of Paul, Paul noted over and over, especially in the Corinthian correspondence, how the preaching of the cross was foolishness to Gentiles all around him. The Greeks, the Romans thought that Christianity was just stupid because your Savior, your God, died the extreme penalty of crucifixion. Such an ignominious death is not worthy of a God. So a Christian giving an interpolation would probably have mentioned explicitly the crucifixion. This horrible belief, this stupid belief, had become, by the days of Paul, a badge of honor, and even more so in the years to following, leading up into the 2nd century. As an elitist, as a member of the noble class, Tacitus would have probably been one of many who would have been appalled at this kind of execution, and it's so appalling, so horrible of a way of dying, that Tacitus just subtly refers to Jesus' death as the extreme penalty. And again, it's this curious statement by Tacitus renders the case for authenticity far more likely than not. Now, a second line of reasoning is that the author of Acts tells us that Paul, after leaving Athens, arrived in Corinth. And this is what we read in Acts. And he found, that is Paul, found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, and his wife Priscilla, who recently came from Italy because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he was staying with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. So Paul meets up with Aquila and Priscilla, and he begins to stay with them because they have the same trade. Now, it's highly likely that these are not merely Jews, but Christian Jews, and the implication is supported by the following line of evidence. First, the Romans at this time would not have made a clear distinction between Jews and Christians. Second of all, it is not likely that Paul would have stayed with them if their mutual trade was the only thing they had in common. Why? Well, as soon as Paul moves in with them, he heads to the synagogue to proselytize more Jews. The point being that if Paul is leaving immediately to go proselytize the Jews in the synagogue, it's highly likely that Paul would have spent his days trying to proselytize them if they were not already Christians. Now, either they're going to convert to Christianity at that point, or they're going to just ignore him. It's more likely than not, therefore, that Paul is moving in with them not only because they have the same trade, but because they were fellow Christians. Thirdly, within a year or so of Paul's move to Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila are seen instructing a well-respected minister of the gospel. That these two would do so strongly implies that they have been Christians for several years at least. This evidence strongly suggests that Christians were indeed in Rome in the late 40s and were expelled along with other Jews due to Claudius's decree, thus contradicting Carrier's overall thesis. Finally, in the late 2nd century, Tertullian notes in passing that the Christians were often called Crussians by the Romans. Now, given the fact that Tacitus really did write these things, in other words, Carrier has no good reason to reject the authenticity of Tacitus' reference to Jesus. The question is now, why think Tacitus was correct? Why think that his witness to Christ can be trusted? Well, our point is this, our main argument is this. Whatever Tacitus' original source or sources for his knowledge of Jesus and the earliest Christians, there's good reason to believe that he investigated the Roman records to confirm what he had heard. J.P. Holding offers the following evidence for this hypothesis. He says, first, the Emperor Domitian's niece, Domitilla, and her husband Flavius Clemens were accused of atheism and being carried away by Jewish customs. Since Judaism was a recognized religion, this plausibly refers to a conversion to Christianity. And I'll add to Holding's point by saying this. When we get into the 2nd century, one of the common accusations given against Christians and why they should be persecuted was the accusation that they are atheists. Now, Christians were called atheists for one simple reason. They refused to worship the emperor. And so the fact that we have 2nd century sources referring to Christians as atheists, or at least Christians talking about themselves being accused of being atheists, and the fact that Flavius Clemens and Domitilla are accused of atheism and being carried away by Jewish customs does strongly indicate, or at least strongly imply, that they had converted to Christianity. High-ranking persons, even members of the royal family, converting to this nascent faith serves as a reasonable motive for Tacitus to investigate this movement. Second of all, Tacitus elsewhere shows an interest in pretenders who have supposedly risen from the dead. Thirdly, Tacitus sometimes criticized those whom he respected, like his friend Pliny, when they gave him bad information. How much more would he be willing to do this when considering a movement he did not respect? Fourthly, Tacitus had his honor to maintain as an historian, and we know of one historian Domitian executed because of an innuendo in his work that offended the emperor. An unpredictable Domitian, and a volatile one at that, may very well have become offended at any mention of a deviant movement speaking of a king who never existed. As the son-in-law of Agricola, Tacitus would have had easy access to Roman records. And the sixth reason is it is improbable that Tacitus received this information only from Christians, given the negative assessment he obviously had of them. Now, J.P. Holding benefits a lot from several of the greatest Tacitus scholars of the 20th century, one of them being Clarence Mendel. And this is what Holding argues based on Mendel's work. He says, in the Annals, the work with the paragraph on Jesus, Mendel cites 30 instances where Tacitus uses specific phrases to substantiate a statement or to present a statement for which he does not care to vouch. Mendel also notes that in books 11 through 6 of the Annals, the Jesus side is in book 15, Tacitus concerns himself with the evidence and source references to a greater extent than in earlier books. He relies on other historians, a bronze inscription, reports or memoirs, personal testimonies, and physical evidence. There are indications of searches for first-hand and written evidence. Thus, the passage on Jesus comes in the middle of one of Tacitus' more carefully documented works. In reporting a conspiracy of Piso to assassinate Nero, Tacitus acknowledges the difficulty of accurate knowledge of such conspiracies, indicates where his knowledge is uncertain, and does not use one of Pliny's quotes as positive evidence because he considers it wholly absurd. So Holding concludes, by evidential standards, Tacitus passes the test of reliability with flying colors. In his book, Did Jesus Exist?, Bart Ehrman offers an interesting, if not original, objection to the evidence we've just given. He says this: Tacitus is precisely wrong in one thing he says. He calls Pilate the procurator of Judea. We now know from the inscription discovered in 1961 at Caesarea that as governor, Pilate had the title and rank not of procurator, one who dealt principally with revenue collection, but of prefect, one who also had military forces at his command. This must show that Tacitus did not look up any official record of what happened to Jesus, written at the time of his execution, if such a record existed, which is doubtful. He therefore had heard the information. Whether he heard it from Christians or someone else is anyone's guess. Now, Holding gives a fair response to Ehrman's contention, and he says this: however, it is open to question whether this is even an error on Tacitus' part. We should first consider the difference between these two titles. A procurator was a financial administrator who acted as the emperor's personal agent. A prefect was a military official. In a minor province of the empire like Judea, there was probably not much difference between the two roles, and the same person would very likely hold both offices simultaneously. Critics assume that because there is an inscription that describes Pilate as a prefect in Caesarea, that therefore this was his sole title. But other literary evidence shows that Pilate likewise held the title of procurator. The Jewish historian Josephus calls Pilate a procurator in Antiquities 18:3-1. In practical terms, both the procurators and prefects in Judea had the power to execute criminals who were not Roman citizens. This is a difference that is no difference at all. Now, one of the interesting things about this little dispute is that Carrier actually agrees with Holding on this score. Carrier says this: the abundant evidence adduced by Jones and Miller, he's citing classical scholars from an earlier generation, this evidence sufficiently confirms that in the time of Jesus, when Pilate governed Judea, he was and was known by his peers to be both a prefect and a procurator, even if that fact was not always mentioned, and confirms the same fact in the time of Tacitus, as inscriptions of his time attest, and in all years in between. And thus, nothing had changed except at most the frequency of which title was mentioned when mentioning only one. Those viewing this video may be a little confused. Why is the Christ-Mythicist referring to the time of Jesus? Carrier seems to have written this essay before he became fully convinced, or is at least willing to put into writing his doubts about Jesus' historicity. In any case, don't draw too much from this. Carrier may just be playing devil's advocate here, assuming that there was a man named Jesus during his time. Pilate may have been known both as prefect and procurator. In any case, this objection given by Bart Ehrman and others is probably not very valid. It's probably itself mistaken. Pilate probably had both titles, or went by both titles. Now, Ehrman believes that Tacitus' error notwithstanding, and we've just shown that it's not really an error, his reference to Jesus is historically trustworthy. This is what Ehrman says. His reference shows that high-ranking Roman officials of the early 2nd century knew that Jesus had lived and had been executed by the governor of Judea. Holding notes that Tacitus turns out to be an extremely rich source of data who confirms important aspects of Christian history. First of all, he regards Christus as the founder of the movement, and this refutes ideas that Paul or some other person was the ideological head of Christianity. Second of all, he confirms the execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Thirdly, he indicates that Jesus' death checked Christianity for a time. This would hint at the probability that Christianity was recognized to have had some status as a movement prior to Jesus' death. And fourthly, he identifies Judea as the source of the movement. This works against ideas that Christianity was designed piecemeal from pagan religions. Think about Holding's insights for a second. If Holding is right, and I think he is, Tacitus is an important witness for other reasons than just the fact that he refers to Jesus having lived and died during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus is saying that Jesus is the one that founded the Christian movement. Nobody else did. So Paul is not the true founder of Christianity, as many progressive Christians try to say today, and as many skeptics of Christianity try to say today. And second of all, Christianity did start in Judea, a section of the world that shunned pagan literature, paganism, Hellenistic savior gods, and so forth. And the fact that Christianity started in Judea, therefore, is at least good evidence, if not conclusive evidence, against the history of religion school. So you'll remember those pillars of Christ-Mythicism that we looked at, one being that there are no reliable non-Christian testimonies to the existence of Jesus. That is refuted by Tacitus. And then the history of religion school being another pillar, and the reference to Tacitus itself is an indication, if not a good one or strong one, that the history of religion school is indeed false. If all we had was Tacitus, we would have sufficient evidence that Jesus existed. Tacitus alone stands as an absolute refutation of the Christ-Myth-thesis. What I would like to do is recommend to you at this point a debate between J.P. Holding and Kenneth Humphreys, who is a popular Christ-mythicist. He has a website promoting his view. Well, Holding, several years ago, debated Humphreys on the unbelievable radio broadcast. There's now one of the leading broadcasts that is hosted by Justin Brierley, and he has multiple debates between Christians and non-Christians, atheists versus theists, and so forth on his channel. But Holding debated Kenneth Humphreys, and it's kind of humorous. Holding camps out in Tacitus. He doesn't go anywhere else. He doesn't go to the New Testament. He doesn't go to any other witness to Jesus. He simply hangs out in Tacitus. And as far as I'm concerned, the debate is a slaughter. Holding demonstrates quite conclusively that Jesus existed simply on the basis of Tacitus' witness. So in conclusion, we ask the question, did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? In the previous video, we saw good evidence that Jesus may very well have existed. In this video, we have seen good evidence that Jesus did exist. Indeed, even if we had nothing other than the testimony of Tacitus, the historicity of Jesus would nevertheless be firmly established. With Tacitus and Suetonius together, we learn the following facts about Christ and the earliest Christians. Christ died via the extreme penalty, crucifixion, during the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Tiberius, which places the death of Jesus anywhere between 26 and 36. A riot broke out over the identity of Christ around the year 49, which resulted in Emperor Claudius expelling Jews and presumably Christians from the city of Rome. Later, during the reign of Nero, in the year 64, Christians were blamed for the great fire that consumed the city, and they were subsequently subjected to the most extreme tortures for their identity as Christians. including being fed to beasts in the Colosseum, crucifixions, and burnings. Now, if this weren't enough, we actually have more evidence for Jesus' existence, and we will be discussing that evidence in the videos to follow. I want to thank all of you who've gone this far. I know that this is my longest video so far, and I will always try to keep my videos to around 30 to 45 minutes. This is an exception because of the intricacies in the debate, and it's important that we get the broad picture as to what's going on in the first century. And I think the discussion about Nero and his persecution of the Christians and the fire and so forth sets the right tone for evaluating the authenticity and reliability of Tacitus' reference to Jesus. And when that is assessed, I think that we walk away with a clear conviction that the man Jesus really did exist, even if we had no other witness to this fact than Tacitus himself. If this video and our series is a blessing to you, I would like to encourage you to subscribe to our channel, as well as give a like. This is very helpful to us. I hope this has been a blessing. I hope you've learned a lot from it. And I hope to see all of you next week as we analyze even more evidence for the historicity of Jesus.